Actually, I've titled this From Carer to Consumer, because I've sat on both sides of the fence. As a single parent, my only child, Brian, suffered his first psychotic episode at age 16. His behaviour had been erratic for some time, and I had no experience of mental illness, and put his mood swings and odd behaviour down to typical teenage angst. On this particular day, I found my son sitting on the lounge room floor with a speaker from our portable player held up to each ear, and he was swaying back and forth as if in some kind of trance. Unable to get any response from Brian, in a panic, I rang our local doctor. He recommended I call the CAT team. I had absolutely no idea what they did. All I was told is that they'd be able to help my son. When they finally arrived, 3 or 4 hours later, I had lots of questions. What is happening to my son? Is he going to be okay? What should I do? The blame and shame as a parent haunted me. All I was told was to stand back and that they would deal with the situation. As things became worse, the CAT team rang for an ambulance and the police. By this stage, my son had locked himself in his room and refused to come out. I felt so helpless, standing in the kitchen while all these people crowded my house and forced their way into my son's bedroom and dragged him off and literally threw him into the back of the ambulance. All I was told was which hospital they were taking him to. Panicked and frightened for my son's welfare, I followed in my car. When I arrived at the hospital and checked with the staff on my son's condition, I was told nothing, just that it would be best for me to go home and to phone back in the morning. The frightening and chaotic circumstances in which my son was taken to hospital left me feeling alone and to blame. It didn't seem to matter who I asked what was going on. No one would answer my questions. I felt completely shut out of medication and a treatment plan altogether. I was given no information, no knowledge on what to do, no opportunity to contribute my own personal experience of my son's illness. I felt confused and hopeless to ease my son's pain. By age 18, Brian was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Life didn't get any easier for my son, even when he would take his medication. Although a diagnosis meant I could find out some information about his illness, now that he was 18 years old, I was closed out of the treatment plan totally. Even though Brian was still living at home with me, and I was the one who saw the daily struggle and chaos my son's life had become. Brian developed a drug addiction. He said that taking drugs shut out the noises in his head. Brian would disappear for days on end, and I lived in constant fear for his safety. On the 30th of October 1997, Brian took an overdose. My worst fears were realised. Suffering the sad and tragic loss of my son took its toll on my own mental health, and I became unwell for a period of time. But now I work as a consumer advocate for adult mental health services. Only wish I knew back then what I do today. There are some great support networks in the community. Reach out. And consumer and carers can have input into treatment planning and be supported through this process. And when given this opportunity, it means better health outcomes for everybody, a partnership in healthcare.
Our family's experience around confidentiality over the past 9 years has troubled me greatly. Why so difficult? Why not a clear response? Certainly better things have happened recently. The coroner has stated that confidentiality kills. This can be about extinction of life, but it also relates to the slow, incremental, insidious desperation of powerlessness, frustration, and sometimes rage, which can brew in carers. We need to know about our family members' illness, medications, treatment, progress, and relapse prevention. Why wouldn't we, as parents of young people, want to help? Why are we so determined? I'm sure you can all guess. A trusting therapeutic relationship takes time to develop. But why dismantle a trusting, loving, familial relationship when the clinical connection is essential at a time of illness? Exclusivity of knowledge, secrecy, creates communication difficulties. Dare I comment that it may well add to an already pervasive paranoia. Carers' lives are usually inextricably intertwined with their unwell family member. Confidentiality used by clinicians as an excuse when their time is limited, or if connecting with family is inconvenient, is therefore used as a shield, is unacceptable. Simply poor practice. It fuels distress. It increases desperation. It undermines our confidence. It can even result at times with out-of-the-ordinary behaviour from us. All this occurs at a time when we carers need encouragement, support and information. Grief almost robbed me of those most wonderful, loving memories. I had almost forgotten that I'd lived a life before mental illness. I was losing my feelings of self-worth and could hardly believe that I'd been competent, believe it or not, in a workplace. Our entire family was engulfed with anxiety, tension, self-doubt, exhaustion and pain. There is such a massive fallout when mental illness comes to stay in a family. And still, confidentiality can be used as a distancing mechanism. Our pain and distress are palpable. Such scenarios can destroy a family if support is not available. The ripple effect goes on forever. Carers do need to upskill themselves rapidly. They need to become au fait with legal guidelines concerning confidentiality so they can engage in meaningful discussion with clinicians. Knowledge empowers us all. Clarity does now exist around the issue of confidentiality. Clinicians need to understand the acts that govern them in their workplace. This will ensure a streamlining of two-way sharing and three-way sharing of essential knowledge. The professional knowledge of clinicians, the unique experiential knowledge of carers, and the lived experience of a person with a mental illness. Distancing families leaves us all the losers.
The thrust of what I'm going to say is that there is no legal impediment whatsoever to the kind of information that Catherine and Trish were saying they wanted access to being provided by a clinician or being provided by the system. There is just absolutely none. And what really is in place is a perception about what the law is, or a fear of what the law is, and just a lack of confidence, really, in a lot of situations, to actually come out and exercise your own professional judgment. So I'll give you the three-step guide to what this whole issue about privacy and confidentiality is. And I won't even talk about any sections or any law like that. If you follow these three things, you will never, ever have a problem with the disclosure of confidential information. The first one is respect confidential information. Everyone knows what's confidential. You just know it intrinsically. Treat it with respect. The second one, to a clinician or a professional, treat the patient. Use the information to treat the patient. And the third one is avoid harm, which is the most important. And that can be avoid harm to the patient, it can be avoid harm to the carers, avoid harm to the community. Now, there is always this tension between confidential information that's going to be provided by a person about their illness, and there is always going to, and that tension is going to be with the need to disclose that. But it's really, in practice, probably not that difficult, but occasionally it's unbelievably difficult. And I get presented with problems at work sometimes where I say to the doctor, you will breach the law, whatever decision you make. But you've just got to do the right thing. And so what professionals need to be told, and is what is actually the law, is that a reasoned use of confidential information will always be supported, provided it is reasoned. And I'll give you an example then of what is an unacceptable breach of confidential information and what is a reasoned use of confidential information. An unacceptable breach of confidential information is a case I had recently where a man went to see a psychologist as part of marriage therapy sessions. He had 3 marriage therapy sessions with the psychologist, and then unfortunately the marriage broke down and they ended up in a very bitter access dispute. Now, he was absolutely furious when his wife at the access hearing produced a report from the psychologist he had met with, that he had, as he described it, spilled his guts to over those 3 sessions, and that psychologist had provided a report solely to his wife that she was now using against him in the access dispute. Right? Now, that's just a violation, right? That is not treating confidential information with respect. That is a misuse. Go on to the reason side. It's a doctor who is told by someone he's treating that person has some extremely florid and dangerous thoughts about his mother. Now, I won't venture whether that's a common or an uncommon experience, but I've heard it certainly more than once. And the issue is, well, is that disclosed to the mother or is that disclosed to the family? And I said, well, is it going to be useful in the treatment? And is it going to avoid harm? Now, my view, yes, it's going to be useful in the treatment because the family actually knows what the problem is, the delusional patterns, all that sort of things that they can actually use to be supportive. But more importantly, is it going to avoid harm? And it probably is. And so the family was informed. Now, that is a reasoned disclosure of information, and if I'll now quote a section, but certainly section 120 A of the Mental Health Act permits the disclosure of confidential information without the consent of a patient if it is reasonably necessary in the treatment of that patient. Now, the courts are not so arrogant as to actually look behind what a psychiatrist or a mental health professional is reasonably coming up in a very difficult pressure cooker situation. And so it's perfectly legal, and there is no law that certainly prevents the provision of that information. So what is the key to it? The first one is that the whole thrust of all of these acts and the whole thrust of the consumer-driven law now is for there to just be disclosure up front. When you're engaging a service, just understanding what information is going to be used by them for what purpose. It does not have to be a 10-page document covering every conceivable angle. It's just got to be, if you give our information, we could share it with other services, we could share it with other clinicians, we could share it with your family, but at all times we will treat your confidential information with respect and only use it when reasonably necessary to do so. Now, if someone understands that when engaging a service, there's not going to be that sense of violation about any perceived misuse of confidential information. And it always, I just have to keep coming back to it, where there is a professional who sits down and thinks, what is the best thing to do in this situation for this patient? What is the best thing to do in this situation for the family? And the law is not about stopping that from happening.